With so much going on in Nintendo recently, between changes at Sony and at Microsoft, between the announcement of Wario Land coming to the Nintendo Switch Online, let alone lots of new details coming out about Zelda and Metroid, there's been so much to cover that I haven't really drilled down onto this topic. And so I'm going to do this in the form of an unscripted video where I quickly look through the situation that is unfolding in Europe. And put simply, because of European regulatory changes around the need to have batteries which are removable, Nintendo has started to lay out their plans for how this will affect things. And the particular thing that is catching people's attention is that the Switch 1 console will be discontinued with effect from February at the latest. Now, I have to say this is something which I should have absolutely called a while ago when I did look at this topic, and I'm slightly frustrated that I didn't really, but of course I didn't really think in terms of the original Switch at this point. Clearly there is no real reason for Nintendo to issue redeveloped versions of older hardware. Now, I don't think it's completely impossible that they do at some point create a fourth iteration of the Nintendo Switch for a particular reason. I'm not quite sure what that would be, but I suppose if they were looking to have some kind of classics version of the Nintendo Switch, a very small version, which would be significantly cheaper, but which through the wonders of game share and through other capabilities could link into the rest of the Switch 2 ecosystem, they may still find utility in it. But at the end of the day, as we'll look at in the data in a second, there's really not much expectation that the Switch originally, I should say, is going to continue to be productive for them in terms of major sales. So this article gives a layout of some of the changes that will happen, and it says that there will not be versions that contain user replaceable batteries for some particular features, such as the NES controller. My guess is by now either people have already bought an NES controller or they're not likely to, and so they probably only sell at a trickle. There will be a bit of a surge of people wanting to buy them, I would guess. Then there's also Pokemon Go Plus, Nintendo Switch, Nintendo Switch Lite, the OLED model, the Switch Pro controller, which has probably largely been superseded by the Switch 2 Pro controller at this point, the Sega Mega Drive control pad for Nintendo Switch, I'm very glad I got one, Super Nintendo Entertainment System controller for Nintendo Switch. I may consider getting one of those before the end, although I must admit I'm not the biggest fan of the SNES controller. So these final and revised products are expected to become available from summer 2026 and will be rolled out between now and early 2027. If we look at Nintendo's actual article, there's a few more details that they put out. In particular, they look at things like the change to the battery capacity and to the weight. So you can see that there are some slight changes. The system with the Joy-Cons attached to the Switch 2 is around 14 grams heavier than the current version, and of course the weight of the machine itself is about 10 grams heavier. So having a removable battery will actually increase the weight slightly, but it's still basically the same kind of product. It says that the battery capacity is approximately 1% smaller, which I think is a reasonable approximation given the increase in convenience, I guess, for being able to replace the battery later on. Then we've got the Joy-Con pair, and again, these are roughly around the same, but they are very slightly heavier. And we've got the Pro controller, which is actually now going to be slightly lighter than the current version, but the battery capacity is going to be a fair bit smaller to match. So they've obviously had to look at each individual type of item and see what works best in terms of adjusting for it. They have kept the Nintendo 64 controller. My guess with that is that with Star Fox and Ocarina of Time, they want to be able to continue to sell that in a big way, and I wouldn't completely be surprised if they do bring the Super NES controller back at a certain point, maybe even the NES controller, if they do have a really major game which requires it. But in many respects, the N64 controller is a lot stranger and weirder, like the GameCube controller. These are controllers which are likely to have a particular following, and I don't think many people will particularly want to go back on the SNES specifically for its controllers, although obviously there are many games that are really good as well. It says more information will be shared shortly before each revised product becomes available. Battery replacement kits for each product will be available to purchase from the Nintendo store in Europe in the future. Now, it's probably quite costly to have to redesign all of these things, so it wouldn't completely astonish me if they did start to roll these out at least as an option for other territories. The theory being, I guess, that they could divert some stock to other locations. But I don't think they're likely to do that unless there's some kind of significant evidence of consumer demand, because it could potentially be a bit confusing if you've got two different models, a battery in and a battery out model. However, there is complete possibility that they could test this out in some territories and just see what the demand is like for those things. I'm not entirely sure what the cost differential will be and how to produce these. My guess is that once they've worked out the actual designs, if anything, it might be slightly cheaper to have something with a marginally smaller battery, if what they're looking at in terms of the extra weight and the extra frustration here is all to do with plastics and all that kind of stuff. But it's really impossible to say from that. At any rate, it'll be interesting to see how this pans out. Of course, the question that a lot of people are asking as a consequence is, how does this affect Nintendo's chances of, air quotes, beating PlayStation 2 with the Nintendo Switch? And first of all, we should say it is going to be almost impossible to ever be able to claim that definitively, even if it happens, just by dint of the fact that Sony has never fully confirmed their final figures for PlayStation 2. We know that it did continue to sell at a trickle long after it was superseded in the marketplace, and the estimated figure is somewhere over 160 million. Now, that's an awful lot of numbers, but in many respects, it is still possible that the Switch could beat that. Obviously, losing the European market is going to be pretty significant, and assuming that there is no late-stage extra version of the Switch, or some kind of nostalgic version of the Switch even, I could see that could take out maybe about 500,000, 100,000 to 500,000 potential sales over the next couple of years. And I think to illustrate this, let's just go over to the sales data, the consolidated sales data. This is as of the latest update, although we're looking here at the DS numbers. Let's go over to the Nintendo Switch and see what we've got. So you can see that Nintendo issue this on their website every year, and they break it down into the particular regions. So we've got Japan, the Americas, Europe, and other, which is a growth area, which includes places like Taiwan and Singapore and Korea. Now, in particular, we've got here the life to date, and you can see that the total life to date is registered in tens of thousands, so you kind of need to imagine moving the decimal point a little bit, or the comma there, I should say. But it'll be 155 million, bordering on 156 million sold. You can also see in the totals sold per year the way the trend has gone. So we hit our heights, 21 million, 28 million, 23 million. These were pretty big numbers during the absolute height of the Nintendo Switch. Bear in mind the financial years refer to when the year ends, so financial year 22 ended in March 22, and then this is the financial year 23, the one which had the success of the movie and Tears of the Kingdom would have been financial year 24, because it would have started in April 2023. And you can see that all of these had pretty big numbers for the Nintendo Switch, but it started to drop off. So it did a 2/3 drop off there, and now it's dropped by about 60%. Now, I would say this pattern of going down to about a third of its former status each time is something that we have seen with other Nintendo consoles, and you can't draw direct comparisons really, because obviously all of the consoles had different ends of life. But if you look at the 3DS, you can kind of see that the 3DS was doing okay in its midlife. It did quite well. It picked up a little bit of anything in financial year 2017, which ended with the release of the Switch, but only for the last 3 weeks or so. And of course, that was the year which had things like Pokemon Go, and so it was a pretty big year for Nintendo, and 7 million copies, or 7 million units, I should say, of the 3DS being sold was a pretty big one. The next year, they gave it a bit of a fillip, because they gave it the 2DS XL, the new 2DS XL, I should probably say. And of course, that meant that the 3DS continued in pretty good form through to March of 2018. There were still new games. There were still Samus Returns and Hey Pikmin and other titles released during that time. And so it was only in financial year 2019 where, yes, there were still the odd games, and even right until March 2019, there was a new Kirby game, or an old Kirby game adapted, I should say. But fundamentally, this was the end days for the 3DS. And you can see this kind of pattern here where 255, okay, these are not perfect numbers, but roughly it's a third of what we had before. And then 69 is roughly a third of the year before that. And 17 is roughly a third of the year before that. Obviously, I'm talking very, very roughly, but you get the idea. There is a slight pattern to the way these things drop off. Wii U, clearly very different because it just dropped off a cliff. Although even then, I suppose you could say that if you look at the totals there, well, it went from 326 to 76 to nothing. Maybe there's some kind of pattern there in terms of the way people move away from these consoles. With the classical DS, we moved from 31 million to 27 million. That was at its height. And then in its last full year on the market, the year in which it was superseded by the 3DS, it was still going strong with 17 million. Then roughly a third, 510, probably about close to half, but within the third bracket, I guess, 235. And then it really dropped off a cliff with 13 from 2013 to 2014. Obviously, during this period, there were still a couple of major games for the DS in the form of the 2012 Pokemon games, but by and large, this was not a major time for expansion for the DS. The Wii had an odder pattern because it was really on the wane for a long time. This was a system that started incredibly well, but it didn't really maintain momentum. And so even if you look at it, I mean, financial year 2012, that means the year ending March 2012, which was months and months before the Wii U was hoving into the distance. And actually, already the Wii had substantially dropped. It was going below 10 million sales, and that was a trend that was continuing. It's a slightly less drastic hemorrhage than the ones we've seen before, because of course the Wii still was the major console, Nintendo putting everything behind it. But then that pattern of roughly a third starts to take over. Again, very, very rough numbers, but 900s to 300s to 100s to 40s to 10s. It's a pretty smooth case here. And I think it's likely that there are certain patterns here that will probably continue, with possibly adjustments here or there, depending on how many Switch games Nintendo put out, depending on how many different things Nintendo do to push the Switch 2 particularly. But all things considered, I think we're expecting something in that ballpark. That next year will be about a third of what we went before, and then the year after will be a third of that. So let's see what that would look like. Well, first of all, we've got the hardware from last year. You can see in Europe there are about 800,000 units. So maybe next year, if things go completely to plan, obviously the next financial year will pretty much have a complete year. So we're probably looking at about 200,000 units that would be sold during that time. I suspect, if anything, it might go up a little bit because people will try to get those systems before they go out. So maybe we're closer to 250, but not much more than that. And then we're probably looking at maybe 70, 80 would have happened the year after, but obviously those won't happen. And then maybe 20, 30 in Europe the year after. So that's where I get 100,000 from. The reason I kind of also said it could go up to, maybe 500,000 is that if Nintendo were to do a massive push, if they were to have a very big new game that was on the Nintendo Switch, then obviously that would have a pretty big effect on the landscape. Maybe they do some kind of big Zelda push for the 40th and try to do a version which has Tears of the Kingdom or something alongside it. I don't think that's likely, and I certainly don't think it's likely now that the Switch is being discontinued in the European region. The only reason I could have seen it is if they felt like they needed to have some kind of budget option, and of course they don't have one for the Switch 2 at present. But all things considered, I don't think it's going to drastically affect where Nintendo are. Now you can see that 1/3 line is continuing. Based on that, I would have thought maybe if there is a bit of a fillip in Europe, perhaps we're looking at 150,000 sold in the next fiscal year. Perhaps then we're looking at 50,000 sold afterwards, and perhaps then a few more. I would guess that would take the Nintendo Switch up to somewhere in the ballpark of 158, maybe 159 million units sold in its lifetime. There is the possibility, as I say, that they could do something else, and I wouldn't rule it out completely, because if it becomes perilously difficult to try to release a Switch 2 Lite at a price point which anybody would consider budget, then if they can use game share, if they can use some kind of other adaptations to do with the Switch what they kind of did with the 2DS, and make the absolute most bare bones version of a console you can imagine, I could see that having an appeal. And whether or not it would have an appeal of tens of millions, I very much doubt. But not all Nintendo consoles need to do tens of millions. If we go back to the 3DS and we look particularly at the new 2DS XL, well, look, I mean, that console actually did pretty well. But even then, the new 2DS XL, by the end, we were looking at numbers that were, 12 million there. But then for the 3DS XL, it was just over 2 million. And, for some of these, it was pretty low as well. So we've only got 4 million for the new Nintendo 3DS. I could see if they can price it really effectively, if they can price it really aggressively, maybe find some ways to cut it down even further, to cut the shell size down, maybe to reduce the battery in some way using some kind of technological power, maybe have it run through a Switch 2 in some weird way, so it's kind of linked to the Switch 2 while it's in the house, and then has some kind of limited capacity while it is out and about. Maybe they could do something which has 2, 3, 4 million of sales in it, and that's why I don't think it's impossible that Nintendo could substantially outstrip the PlayStation 2, because I think even if they said, well, the PlayStation 2 had over 160, if Nintendo could show 163, 164, I think the Switch would probably take the crown. Fundamentally, though, I don't think they really care. I don't think it's something that most people are going to spend much time thinking about, and even if they do, I don't think it's actually that consequential for Nintendo, because ultimately these are old systems. If they could guarantee the Switch 2 would take the crown, well, I'm sure they'll be very happy, but at the moment, they're switched in the rearview mirror. They really want to concentrate on the Switch 2, and that's why I'm not particularly thinking that they will either push for this or expect to get to the 160 mark. I think we're probably looking in 2 years' time, 3 years' time, 158, 159. That would be my central expectation. Outside chance of 157 if the bottom really does fall off. If that were the case, it would probably be because they just withdraw the thing from the international market early. But I think they probably think that they can sell some copies in India, sell some hardware models in other parts of the world, especially if they've got quite a big backlog of stock for whatever reason. I doubt they will have, because they've known for a long time this change was coming in Europe. It's not a surprise to them. They've had this plan in the back of their mind since at least 2025, I believe. So I don't think they will have overproduced stock of the Switch, but if they have that, they could use it as a way to experiment with other markets. And again, if something took off, then maybe that would be effective. But there does come a certain point where the costs of manufacturing the thing outstrip the utility of it. The only benefit really is that the Switch 2's margins appear to be significantly lower, and so therefore, because the margins of the original Switch and the Lite particularly are much higher, they can kind of get away with a lot more of a bit of flexibility with how much they're selling and where they're putting them, because they're still getting a decent return on their investments. So I think they might continue to create them for a while if they can see an opportunity, but I don't really see it. I think we're probably coming towards the end game for the Switch. And that does mean they need to come up with a big transition to Switch 2 that probably expedites the pace at which they need to do a Lite model. But there are frustrations with doing that, and that's something that I will look at another video in times to come. Thanks for watching as ever, and I'll look forward to seeing you next time for another Nintendo Forecast.